Here's a tip before we start. The problem with cars is that, unlike many objects, we actually know them, we understand them, we're familiar with them way too much. And the problem is, though, that when we see a car in a position such as this, a very common position of a car to draw, what we often think of in our mind is a car looking like this. And if we're not careful, as we draw this car, we'll be wanting to change it little by little into looking more like this. And the only way to escape doing this is to actually observe what's happening in this car more carefully. And I think the clearest place to see this is in the wheels, where when we look at a car side on, the wheel hub is very rounded. And therefore, when we go to draw a car, knowing that this is how it looks, it can be very tempting to try and make this wheel hub rounder than it really is, to be drawing something more like this, because we're looking at this but we're thinking of this. And of course, that ends up being all wrong for the perspective. What we have to do is look at this shape and not think of it as a wheel hub, but think of it as a shape that we need to draw. And we're looking at this sort of shape for there, rather than this sort of shape around the wheel. And when we get to the front wheel, it's even tighter. The other place in a car this can really affect is the windows, because we know the side windows look like this. And so we're wanting to draw something that looks like this. What we see is more this. But because we're thinking this, it can be easy to be extending this shape way too much. So the secret to draw an accurate car is to not think of it as a car, but to simply see it as lines and shapes in relation to each other, and to seek to draw those lines and shapes in proportion. Let's see how it goes. I start with the back window because I think this is probably the easiest shape to draw in proportion. That's a significant part of the drawing that we can then use as a starting point to work out, to reference where we want the other lines to go. So now I'm doing this left-hand side of the car, all the windows, and look, after what I've just said, I probably let this stretch out a little too far. I probably should have kept that furthest window just a little bit tighter in its shape. What this means now is that that left-hand side of the car protrudes out, comes out a little bit more than it should for the tightness of this perspective angle, but it's probably a small enough difference that I think we'll get away with it if we're not comparing closely with the reference. So I'm working down the back again because that's the easiest place to get a sense of the proportions that we're using. When I have the baseline of the back of the car worked out, I've then got my reference points to do the left-hand side, to get those angles that go up from the lower angle and down from the upper angle, that wedge shape that I need to get. But at this point, I'm putting in the details of the boot, as we would call it, or the back of the hatch. I suppose this is a hatch. You can tell I normally draw architecture. I have a fairly boxy style with my lines, and to do all these curves is a little bit out of my comfort zone for line work. So I've got those wheels in place, and they were tricky to establish because they're really not very round. Again, in our mind we're thinking a circle, and really they're very, very narrow, what we see of these wheels. And again, I need to pay attention to where these wheels line up with the mudguards that I've already put in place. And then it's a case of putting some hatching in to indicate the color of the tires, simply because they are a lot darker. And now I'm working at these angles, and I'm using the same technique I use for measuring perspective angles in buildings, using my pen as a guide, measuring the angle and then transferring it across. Now you're watching this double time, so it actually took me twice as long to do this. And if you want to have a go drawing this yourself, this photo will be on my YouTube channel community page. So you can go there, print off a copy, and have a go at drawing this hatchback yourself. But cars for most people are a readily available subject to draw, so they're very good in that respect. Again, this front wheel is even tighter. It's much more foreshortened. We see very little of it. We need to totally forget what a tyre looks like side on and draw the shape that we see. Side mirrors are really important for cars to give a sense of this is a car. And now I do this banding around the back window, and I have to position the rear windshield wiper, which I position a little bit too high. But there are worse crimes in a drawing. And now I very quickly, but not this quickly, put in the shadow under the car. Shadow under a car is always really important to give it a sense of sitting on the ground. There's almost always some shadow somewhere. So it's important not to neglect it, but also to get where it is correctly, because where that shadow is will tell us where the sun is, in this case more or less overhead. So now I'm just doing a few more details that I can see. And so at no point have I tried to draw a car. What I've done is I've looked at the shapes and the lines and the angles between them and tried to join them up in a way that copies my reference. Just a little bit of hatching now for those rear lights. And then I'm just looking at, are there any more things to do? And I think I will just hatch in this darker band around the rear window, having a slightly uneven effect to it to reflect the fact that some parts of it are catching more light than others. And I didn't want it to be too black, because then it just would have overwhelmed the drawing, I think. And then that's pretty much it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I hope you found this interesting, helpful. Print off a copy, and why not have a go drawing it yourself? And if you haven't, why not subscribe to my channel and hit notifications? But whatever you do, whatever you're drawing, have fun.